This is RT coming to you live from Moscow with me, Marina Joshi. The United States is facing the prospect of going it alone in Syria after Washington's key ally withdrew its support for airstrikes. In a historic vote, British lawmakers defeated a motion by David Cameron's government, marking the first time in recent years that the UK has refused to take part in a US-led intervention. Military action was rejected by a margin of 13 votes, with 30 members of Cameron's own party turning against him. Parliament refused to sanction British involvement in Syria, even if UN inspectors conclude that Damascus was indeed responsible for the use of chemical weapons earlier in August, an attack that reportedly killed hundreds of civilians. In the eyes of lawmakers, Cameron was unable to make a sufficiently convincing case against Assad. Well, when pressed by MPs to explain why the Syrian regime would have resorted to a step provoking foreign action, the premier admitted that British intelligence could not pinpoint a motive. Cameron then urged lawmakers to make their own judgment against Assad and act on their convictions. That didn't win over Parliament, creating an embarrassing situation for Downing Street. Sarah Firth in London has the details.
Defeated and humiliated, that's how the Prime Minister is being portrayed today after that major political blow with Parliament voting against military action. It means that the Prime Minister's decision essentially to recall Parliament, to bring this motion against possible military action in Syria has backfired spectacularly. Many of the Prime Minister's own party members turning against him. Labour today calling his leadership reckless and cavalier. It's not going to sit comfortably with the Prime Minister. This issue of foreign policy, and it was a major issue that he really stamped his name upon, is one that the Prime Minister of the country usually leads on. And you heard when the results of that vote was announced last night in the House of Commons, those cries for the Prime Minister to resign. Now, questions over whether his leadership is really going to be under threat. It's thought that's quite unlikely at this point, but certainly he stands in a much weakened position today. And as we said, that defeat really not putting him in a comfortable position at all. Very many people feeling that the vote reflected the lack of public appetite for any military action, certainly with the evidence that was on the table. Of course, all eyes will now be on the US and what course of action they'll take. They've lost a major ally in Britain voting against military action. The indicators coming from the US is that they'll be willing, regardless, to go it alone. In terms of a timeline, you've got the UN inspectors coming out the country on Saturday and presenting their preliminary findings. So all eyes will be closely on that and then the actions that follow. But as we said, certainly the Prime Minister today here, both internationally and here at home, standing a little less tall today, I think.
Meanwhile, the French president is standing firm on his readiness to strike against the Assad government. François Hollande says Paris is in no way influenced by the vote in London and reserves the right to act unilaterally. Canada has also voiced support for intervention, but has shied away from agreeing to take part. However, some of America's other NATO allies have taken a more lukewarm approach. With British forces now out of the question, Germany, Italy, Austria, and Spain say they won't back Washington without a UN resolution. Now, this as military experts across the globe warn against military intervention in Syria. British Admiral Sir Alan West told RT that weakening the Assad regime would provide a boost to extremist forces who could then turn against the West.
All my experience of wars, and I've been in them, and in the lead up to them, and I've been running them and things, is to find that you have a law of unintended consequences. You think you're just going to do one little thing, but actually things then happen and it expands. The nations like the US and the UK and France and Turkey need to be very, very careful about what action they take. We need to be very clear what is it we actually want to achieve. What is the end state we want? We need to have in place mechanisms militarily to ensure that things don't go beyond a certain degree. But I'm not at all convinced that an attack would actually help the condition of the people within Syria. We've seen what happened in Iraq. We've seen what's happened in Afghanistan. I have no doubt that the al-Qaeda group, and they're a very large group, I'm afraid, in the opposition, funded by people who haven't thought through what this really means, would be delighted if America and Britain and Turkey and France attacked Assad. They would be delighted by it. But that doesn't mean they like us, and they want to actually, they oppose us and would like to do us harm. But in a temporary basis, that would suit them. So we need to be very, very careful how we actually act.
UN inspectors in Syria are set to present their findings on the use of chemical weapons over the weekend. A former commander of the British military's Chemical Defence Regiment told RT the sketchy evidence on the attack leaves room to suspect that radical rebels were behind it.
We've got to piece together all the intelligence available. I'm very much in the favour that the Permanent Five perhaps should form a team of experts, not just chemical but military as well, who could look at all the evidence that's on the ground in Syria and also the intelligence that's been gathered by those intelligence services and put it together. That then only the chance to come up with a 90 to 90% guaranteed answer of who is responsible. But at the moment, the level of confirmation is probably only in the 70% bracket. Proliferation of chemical weapons or biological weapons out of Syria into terrorist groups' hands must be the worst case scenario here. There have been reports, uncorroborated, that some terrorist groups have gained some of these stocks out of the Syrian stockpile, yet to be confirmed. But that of course is a possibility in future.
Now, the U.S. president could go ahead with a limited strike against Syria despite the withdrawal of support from Washington's closest ally. Barack Obama is now struggling to put together an international coalition willing to launch action against the Middle Eastern state. Now, the Pentagon is moving its naval forces closer to Syria in position for immediate strike if the order is given. 4 destroyers are currently deployed in the Mediterranean Sea, and a 5th is reportedly on its way, all of them armed with dozens of Tomahawk cruise missiles. Well, there's also a NATO task force in the area consisting of 4 more ships. All of that in addition to the vast military presence of the U.S. and its allies on the territories of nearby countries. RT's Marina Portnaya reports on the ongoing developments.
Officials have warned that President Obama has not made a final decision, but all signs are suggesting that a strike could occur as soon as United Nations inspectors, who are currently investigating last week's alleged chemical attack in Syria, leave the country. They are scheduled to depart from Damascus on Saturday, and that's when the UN experts are expected to brief the UN Security Council on their findings. Now, the White House is expected to present its case for military action against Syria to congressional leaders. That may have already happened during a conference call Thursday evening. Administration officials say that they have intelligence that shows that forces loyal to President Bashar al-Assad carried out last week's alleged chemical weapons attack in the suburbs of Damascus. However, critics say that the intelligence that the Obama administration does not directly tie Assad to the alleged chemical weapons attack. President Obama is reportedly basing his case of military action in 2 ways, 2 points. He says, first and foremost, he believes the U.S. needs to safeguard international standards against the use of chemical weapons. We all remember how he made his statement of chemical weapons use being that red line that can't be crossed. And he also says that the use of chemical weapons is a threat to America's national interests. And now he believes that Syria indirectly is a threat to America's national interests. Now, we should keep in mind that if President Obama does order a military strike on Syria, he would be doing so without congressional approval and lacking approval from the United Nations Security Council, a resolution which is required according to international law. So if the U.S. moves in unilaterally without approval from the international community, from the United Nations, it would be acting in violation of the UN Charter. But by all reports, by all accounts, by everything that seems to be coming out, it seems as though the U.S. president is going to move ahead with his plan, even if he has to move ahead on his own, as opposed to how he previously planned to move ahead with some European partners. And while President Obama is inching closer towards international military action against Syria, U.S. citizens have taken to the streets in New York, Washington, D.C., and several other cities around the country to protest airstrikes against the Syrian people. According to recent polls, only 9 of Americans support a war in Syria. Protesters that came out into the streets say that just like with weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, false information they believe is being told now about Syria to justify another war.
Now, U.S. media reports have pointed to the likely source the U.S. is relying on for its claim that the Syrian government used chemical weapons against civilians. The proof is said to be based on intercepted phone conversations, evidence that was also used by Washington a decade ago to justify the Iraq war. Gareth Porter, an analyst specializing in U.S. national security policy, says the Obama administration doesn't seem to be clear on its own objectives.
It is just so difficult to figure out what the administration really thinks that it's doing. And seriously, though, you know, it is sometimes stated that we have to do it for humanitarian purposes, and sometimes because of international law, both of which are highly debatable, to say the least, in terms of recent history as well as previous history of U.S. policy. And, you know, it begins to look like there's a small coterie of people within the administration who have gotten the idea that they want to do something, and they have somehow prevailed on the president to do something that he apparently didn't want to do. And that presents a real mystery of major proportions.
Meanwhile, Syria's neighbors and other regional powers are closing ranks against a possible intervention. Jordan, where the U.S. has an air base, says its territory cannot be used as a launch pad for any military action against Syria. Iraq says it will refuse to provide its airspace for an attack on its neighbor. And Egypt has issued a strong warning against foreign intervention in Syria. Lebanon's foreign minister has spoken out against military action, saying its airspace will not be available. And Hezbollah, which backs Assad's forces, has also made it clear that it opposes any intervention and would not stand idle if Syria is attacked by the U.S. and its NATO allies. RT's Paula Sleer is in Beirut with the details.
The street is angry, apprehensive and fearful. The mood in the region is that the winds of war are blowing. In Syria, both sides are vowing to fight for their country. Many are afraid that if America launches military intervention, this will only result in a bloodbath. Here in Lebanon, Hezbollah has said it will not stand idly by if Assad is fired on. This is a serious indication from the military group that it plans to get involved. And any kind of Hezbollah involvement will see rockets fired at Israel. Already in Israel, thousands of residents have been going to post offices to collect gas masks. The country is in a state of high alert, and Army Reserve soldiers have been called up. There is clearly the sense that something big is on the cards. Paula Sleer, RT, Beirut.
And we'd like to know what you think about the situation in Syria, so log on to our website, rt.com, to vote in our latest web poll.